Yorkshire.
Power up.
Okay, is this mic on? Yes, hello. Hi, Bradford.
It looks like the whole of Bradford has come out to see us this evening. Very happy about that.
If you could just stay back from the front, we're going to have to get security, okay?
Yeah, it's a fire hazard, I think, how many people there are in this room right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for enjoying us, for joining us this evening. I'm Keith Stewart, the games editor of The Guardian.
I'm Jordan Erica Webber, and I write about games for The Guardian.
I'm Rhianna Pratchett, and you probably just heard me speak about an hour ago.
Literally an hour ago, yep.
And, well, if you're going to say that, then I'm going to say that. I'm Charles Cecil, Revolution Software, and you may have heard me speak, but if you didn't, I have been writing adventure games for a number of decades.
How many decades, Charles?
You
lost count.
I wrote my first game in 1981.
1981. 9 years before I was born. That's good. That's a thing we have to do every time we do
That's
something
why I
like
feel
this.
slightly embarrassed, because my youthful looks, of course, would hide the fact that I've been doing this for so long.
And you're local, right? You live nearish here.
Well, we're North Yorkshire, and of course there's a lot of competition between West Yorkshire and North Yorkshire, but I guess it's all Yorkshire, yes.
I'm from the south. I know.
Oh, South Yorkshire. Here we have South Yorkshire as well.
Represent. Rhianna, whereabouts are you from?
Originally Bristol, but I'm sort of been London-based since about 18.
Okay, cool. Do you want to do you as well? You live far away. You come
I've
from
lived
a
in
long
lots
way
of different
away.
places. I live in Frome in Somerset. It took me a very long time to get here.
But you were born in Manchester?
No, I was born in Milton Keynes.
Damn it.
So-
That's me trying to bring in the
Is it quick to
northern-
get anywhere from Frome?
No. There's about 2 trains leave a day, and if you miss them, then you're stuck in Frome. And that's it. No, there's no getting out once the last train has left the station.
Sounds
So,
like
no,
a sort of
it's difficult.
Simon Pegg film, doesn't it?
It is. It's very much. I think a lot of his comedy is influenced by life in Bristol and the southwest. So yeah. So we should talk about video games, shouldn't
Yeah,
we?
today is a good day to talk about video games.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to ask you both, because you both your talks today have both like covered your long histories in video games. Charles is obviously slightly longer than yours, Rhianna. But I just wondered how you think storytelling has kind of evolved since you both started your career in games. How has storytelling changed in the games industry since you started it in the key ways?
Well, using professional writers, I guess, would be the main thing for me. So, or using professional writers a lot more. When I first started out as a journalist, I mean, writing was getting done, but it was all with designers most of the time that did it, or whoever fancied a go. Now, professional writers are being hired fairly regularly. Writers are being used in house a lot more, and the position of narrative designer has expanded a great deal. Writing is just being taken. Narrative is being taken a lot more seriously. There are conferences for it. There are awards for it. Press, developers, and players are taking it a lot more seriously now. So that'd probably be the key things for me.
How much of that is to do with kind of tech and change and advances in technology, and how much of that is to do with the culture? Because 1981, I don't know what video games were like back then because I hadn't been born yet. But were there stories in games in the 80s?
Okay, well, that's at the heart of it. I think that's the other way of coming at this, and that's that back in those days, you really only told the story in an adventure, and that was everything else. Now, of course, things have their own stories. I've just been playing the wonderful Galaxians, and I'm appalled at how bad I am. I mean, I used to be good. And, of course, they have stories, but as far as actually the structure of a story, it was only an adventure. The adventure was the genre that owned the story, and then as time moved on, clearly the story became a reward in a first-person shooter or in an RPG, and Somebody asked a very good question about what the definition of an adventure was, and I think still in adventures, what we do is we mould the gameplay with the narrative advances in a way that other genres don't. Whereas obviously, wonderful Tomb Raider is much more about the physical and the story progressing as you progress, rather than interweaving it directly into the. You're going to get very cross with me, aren't you?
No.
I can see it.
No.
Oh, right.
You can see
Goodness
the
for that. I thought I just offended Rihanna terribly.
You can see the differences in the ways that you can approach narrative in the different games you've worked on, right, Rihanna? Because in Mirror's Edge, the story was in chunks in between the different action bits, whereas in Tomb Raider, it does, as Charles said, it's more throughout. Is that a good way
that's
to...
really, as I was talking about in my previous talk, because everything had been designed with no narrative in mind, and it's kind of mad that games will do that, but you can actually get very far down the development line without considering story that much. And that kind of has led to the situation which we're sort of trying to kind of deal with now, that narrative has often been thought of as an afterthought, so there's still a lot of fallout and residual feelings that writing really isn't that important, and it can just be slotted in, and that has started to change a little bit more, but we're still sort of, and everyone thinks they can be a writer, and there's a lot of people kind of giving feedback to you that think they know about writing because they've watched a lot of movies, and it's usually the movie they watched the night before that they would like you to now change the game story to.
So does that explain the difference between the way that narrative is approached in adventure games like you work on, Charles? I mean, because would it be possible to make an adventure game and get 90% in development without having any writing in it?
No, what for an adventure game, and this really supports very much what Rihanna's saying. We need the core story and we need the core gameplay mechanics, and the two kind of move in parallel because they're absolutely interwoven. Whereas you could sort of say that with a first-person shooter where you get a chunk of narrative that comes as a reward for completing a level, that really could be written very, very late in the day. I mean, obviously it would affect the surroundings, but it really doesn't fundamentally affect the gameplay. So for us, the two are interwoven. But I mean, just to throw in something else. I mean, I'm a real huge fan of Limbo, and now Inside. And what I love in both those games is that they tell a very powerful story without a letter, without a word. And I think that's kind of a lesson, probably, for us all to just sit back and think and say, well, actually, you can tell a very powerful story because we have this extraordinary medium that we work in and enjoy. And for me, it was a real eye-opener that we really mustn't put too much dialogue in. Really, it should be all about the gameplay wherever possible.
Does that lead to difficulties within development teams in kind of understanding what the role of a writer is then? I mean, is there a difference between a writer who strictly does words and a narrative designer, for instance? And does that kind of explain why there's some confusion with hiring and things?
I mean, sort of, but they two can cross over. A writer tends to be concerned with what we traditionally think as the writer's kind of purview, and that is that the story, the characters, dialogue, the word bits. Narrative designers tend to be more concerned with the mechanics by which the story is told, so how gameplay and narrative intersect. Now, I've worked with some narrative designers who've also been writers and done writing themselves in the game. I've worked with narrative designers that have writing experience but aren't writing on this game. So they're usually often designers that just have good narrative sensibilities, and they've probably done some writing themselves. But they're sort of, for the kind of games that I've been working on over the last few years, they're pretty fundamental because they're sort of the conduit between the writers, especially if they're freelance, and the rest of the team. And they tend to be the ones that are trying to get the story working in the game and doing a lot of the sort of heavy mechanical lifting, I guess, with the sort of writers doing the heavy narrative lifting. But games, the AAA games are becoming much more team-focused now. Which I was saying was great because you've got the support of people around you that kind of understand story and character and are willing to fight for it.
And is it possible both of you have worked on games Anna with Tomb Raider and Charles with Broken Sword, and they're both games that are very kind of orientated around mythology and characters who explore and find items and artifacts, and you both of those games look at world mythologies. Is it difficult for you to add something new to those kinds of stories without them becoming kind of action cliches? Is it possible for you to say something in games which deal with kind of mythologies and conspiracies and be able to say something new? And if so, how do you do it?
The granddaddy, of course, of them all is the wonderful Indiana Jones and the series, and particularly Raiders of the Lost Ark, which kind of, being of the age, I remember it just coming from nowhere, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. And for a number of years, the whole Nazi... Sorry, I'm answering a slightly different question. I'm like Donald Trump here, aren't I? The whole sort of... the whole sort of Nazi mythology really was very dominated, and I think you may or may not, but I didn't feel that we could go anywhere near it because it was such a rich idea, but it had been so dominated. And what's quite interesting is that, the fourth version of Indiana Jones, the fourth version film, wasn't as good as it might have been. And certainly my sense is that actually that opens up the whole field now because they don't own that area, that area in the way that they did. So what we did with Broken Sword was bring it into the modern day, which kind of felt quite fresh at the time. The Da Vinci Code was a twinkle in Dan Brown's eyes as he played Broken Sword. So our fans would say, or indeed the National Treasure, dreadful National Treasure film. All of these things kind of very much, I think, came after we were writing our games. And I'd like to think that we actually, in many ways, drove the zeitgeist, because before those games, you did have Indiana Jones, but there really wasn't any. There was Romancing the Stone, a few like that, but very, very few. And the idea then of drawing in historical backgrounds is something that we were doing quite early.
I want to ask about bringing kind of adventure stories like that into the modern age, actually, because I was talking to Richard LeMarchand, who worked on the Uncharted games, and he said they tried, even though they're set in the very modern day, they tried to give them a kind of slightly older feel because it felt more appropriate. And obviously, Rhianna, you came into the Tomb Raider franchise in the modern reboot. They first came out, 20 years ago or however long ago it was. And things have changed significantly since then, in technology and things like that. Did that affect the way that you approached the story, the fact that people live differently now? Does she have an iPhone in the game?
Well, she's got those kind of, is it Beats headphones? Those red headphones?
Yeah.
It was more to do with her kind of character background. So one of the things that I was keen on doing was sort of getting away from the wealthy heiress with all the kind of guns and gadgets and money to deal with any situation. It felt like in this current climate, it wasn't really that relatable or necessarily enjoyable. And so I wanted something that's a little bit more normal, because we know where she's going. She basically ends up as a superhero, more or less. So I just wanted to ground her a little bit in a smattering of reality. So, she goes to UCL, and I actually went and checked the UCL prospectus to check that she could have done archaeology and her best friend could have done film studies there, which was true. And I did things like I made up just as a kind of a little aside thing, an archery club for her at UCL. And that's kind of got put on mugs and things now. And it was just something I made weirdly just when I was doing a little bit of details in her bio, and it's on mugs and notebooks and things now.
So what was it like turning Lara Croft into a millennial then?
Yeah, it was definitely fun to do. I don't think it resonated with all our player base, but it certainly gave us a kind of lot more to work with, because you've got that fun juxtaposition about someone who is basically turning into a superhero but still trying to hold on to a semblance of normal life and friends and kind of just trying to move through life. And I explored that a lot more in the comics, where I could sort of get away with doing things I couldn't in the game. So having her playing playing Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice and ending up running through London fighting the bad guys on the London Underground is something I wish I could have got into the games if I had that power, but I couldn't, so I got it into the comics instead. But the comics are a lot of kind of exploring Lara's kind of normal life and her friends and her character, different elements of her character, I think.
Do you think we're going to get to stage? Obviously, you've been involved in the reboot of Lara, so she's gone back in age. But really interested in asking both of you: do you think we're going to get to a stage where we can kind of see video game characters mature? Because obviously George has been around for a while now. Lara will have been around for a while. Video game characters tend to work kind of like action movie characters, like Jason Bourne, where they're just a kind of archetype and they never change.
Or Indiana Jones.
He
just gets older, but he doesn't get any wiser.
So, I mean, do you think we're going to get to the stage where we can have characters that actually change and mature and have experiences beyond?
And I'm not sure that you really want, because when we do new games, everyone goes, right, well, they're 3 years older. And I actually rather like the model that Tintin has, where they're absolutely ageless and you can play them in different order because they're all self-contained. If you decide that actually the characters are going to get older, then you're kind of beginning to the risk is that then that they get too old. You have to change. So maybe that would be good. But it's a lot easier to keep them at the same age and just let things move forward.
Wouldn't you like to see middle-aged characters in video games or slightly older? Wouldn't you like to see yourself represented in video games?
I'm the same age as George. I'm in my early 30s. I mean, that's all right, isn't it?
But Lara, I mean, she should be in her 40s by now. People keep telling me if she just aged along with the games.
I would have loved to have done a 40-year-old Lara. Like, I think there is a real need to show kind of diversity of age as well. Think how excited people were to see Anna in Overwatch, like an older female character, and it just feels like we're so behind. Medium like TV, I guess, especially with Netflix and Amazon, and the diversity they do not only in gender but ethnicity or sexual orientation, ability, age, and we're just lagging so far behind that. I'd definitely love to do a mature Lara, and we did age Lara between the two games, and we did have the comics sort of filled in the gaps between the two games, so we sort of kept her going, and I think she probably will sort of age going forward. I mean, I would like to see that. I don't think I'd like to keep her at the same age, and we definitely sort of evolved the character between the two games, and that was sort of important, that the first game was a step on her character arc and not the kind of whole thing.
Okay, so if you don't change the age of your character, I found out from your Wikipedia page that apparently he is the longest running protagonist of an adventure game or something like that.
Apparently so.
Guinness Book of World Records.
Yes. Although there are quite a few other developers that claim that that's utter nonsense. So I have no idea.
But how do you change it up? How do you make him stay interesting?
Well, to go back to an earlier question, of course, what you do need is your characters to reflect the time. And, clearly when we wrote the first one, which was 1996, mobile phones didn't exist. So when you made a phone call, you went to a phone box, which, I know you're laughing, that's kind of what it used to be. And then also there are attitudes as well. So the attitude towards diversity has changed considerably. As Rhianna says, and quite rightly, it's now there's much more drive for a much wider, diverse range of characters. So we respond to that. I think that we can be forgiven for games that we wrote 20 years ago because times really were very different. I mean, as a story that I like to tell is that this lovely Syrian guy, Tamir, you'll know Tamir. Came bouncing up to me when I first met him, and he said, "I can't believe that you set a game in Syria." And I remembered, and I said, "But don't you think they were rather stereotypical?" He went, "Yeah, they were stereotypical, but it doesn't matter. They were set in Syria," which was actually very interesting because then you've got a conflict between actually people want to see themselves being reflected, And maybe we could get away with it because it was 20 years ago, but actually it didn't matter that we were slightly stereotypical. It was more, that was trumped by the fact that actually we were going off to places that weren't normally depicted in video games.
Lara went to Syria, didn't she? In the most
She did,
recent.
briefly, yeah.
Yeah. What was that like, having to represent a kind of controversial location?
She wasn't there for very long, and I think if I remember correctly, because does she start? No, she doesn't start off in Syria, does she?
No, she starts off in the snow.
Okay, so that sort of changed. So I think we originally had Syria starting off, and then I think things got moved around in development. But yeah, there wasn't a huge amount of kind of writing around the location. It was mostly about typical kind of Tomb Raider exploring, and it was sort of definitely kind of hark back to the classic Tomb Raider, I think.
What's the research process like for both of you when you're looking into locations outside of the ones that you know?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you actually if you actually went to Syria.
Didn't, no. I would have loved to have gone. But a lot of the research for the Tomb Raider games was done by the team before I was involved. So I probably did a little bit more research for the first game. But both the games, going back to your earlier question about kind of mythology and drawing upon mythology, Noah Hughes, the creative director, always wanted something in the Tomb Raider games that was Googleable. So even if we were taking something, and actually I don't think what we touched on for the first Tomb Raider and Rise was actually that known about. I don't think Himiko was that widely known. Neither kind of Katesh and Koschei, the Deathless, that was largely down to pre-production teams at Crystal, kind of like investigating different areas, and I think they really wanted to do a sort of snowy game, and so they were looking into different mythology. And I think Baba Yaga was going to be at one point more woven into the main campaign of Rise. It was largely done before I came on board. So I would do more research when I'm working on, say, kind of a TV or film series. And that would involve going to the places and kind of just getting a sense of the world and the kind of feel of it. But I think certainly with the first game, the art team sort of went to Japan and took a lot of shots and things like that. But it all depends on when I'm brought on board, really.
Would you rather be brought on earlier so that you could take part in that, or are you happy for other people to do it?
I think I get enough other projects where I get to do that I'm not. I'm happy to be there as a sounding board and talking through different ideas and what the narrative potential was in them. And I did that a little bit on Rise because John was sort of off doing some pre-production work on that, and I was working on the comics, so he'd sort of keep me up to date on the things they were looking at, and we'd sort of talk through them a bit. But yeah, I get the kind of the fun of doing that on other projects. I really love doing research, and it's probably satisfying because I have never really done it to that extent since I was at college, and so it's sort of like, it's exercising a different part of your brain, I think. But yeah, I enjoy it, but I don't need to do it on every project.
How about you, Charles?
Yeah, like Rhianna, I absolutely love doing the research and going to places, looking for connections, talking to people. You see so much more than you could possibly do on the internet. And also on the internet, obviously, a lot of it is nonsense. The only way that you can really know that something's true is to actually go and visit. And people are lovely, and we're privileged to work in an industry that people admire. So they're excited that there's going to be a video game. The last one was actually really fun because. I didn't go to Syria, but there's this amazing place called Göbekli Tepe, which is 15,000 years old in Turkey, and it was meant, believed to be the original Garden of Eden. The only problem is it is on the Syria border, and there was a lot of trouble. But it was great because we went with a Turkish friend, and we flew out there, and we were met by a fleet of Turk Telecom vans who took us in very, carefully, and there was dust from the explosions, and it was great. But it kind of adds to the drama. It's fantastic. There were some Japanese tourists, I have to say, which I was really, really impressed by, that came to this place, despite everything that was going on around them.
I wanted to move on a little and talk about some of the things that are happening in video game development and how that might affect your jobs as narrative designers and creators of story. And one of the things that's happening really with a lot of games now is the idea of procedural content generation. So the idea of worlds that are created through algorithms and through processes of the computer rather than just hand-built stuff. And we're starting to see now the idea of procedurally generated narratives and stories which are built from intelligent characters existing in the world and that adapt as we go on. I'm just wondering what you both think of the idea of procedural narratives, of narratives that are formed by intelligent characters in the world interacting and things emerging from that.
Well, I don't believe in procedural narratives, but what I do believe in is dynamic characters that respond to the world which have been affected by the player. And I think they're quite different. So, like No Man's Sky, obviously, huge procedural world, fantastic for space simulations. As far as actually, people telling stories, I think you do need the hand of a storyteller. But, point-and-click adventures are very... the stories are multilinear. They're I think, much more dynamic, and probably for a wider audience is as I say, those characters responding to the world in intelligent and ultimately surprising ways, because we want to be thrilled. We want to say, I did this, and this amazing thing happened. And we also want to get the sense that it isn't necessarily within the control of the game designers, that there was this emergent gameplay. But from a narrative perspective, I hope that we're going to have a job in 5 years' time. I don't know. Maybe we won't. Maybe Microsoft will have come up with this amazing story generator that's much better than we are.
I mean, I don't think that any machine is going to ideally replace a human. I don't know if you saw the Benjamin. Does Benjamin ring any bells? I've got a friend who is a film director, and with a programming friend, he developed a program to write a film script, and then
I did see this.
He filmed the film script, and it kind of makes. The script doesn't really make any sense, but the actors really sort of commit to the performance. And he was sort of talking to me about, whether that can be done with games, and my answer was kind of, fuck off out of my industry. Just no, we're still trying to get it right with just people doing it. And I mean, I guess what you were talking about is more systemic narrative. So, with characters that are reacting to what the player's doing. And I think there's some interesting things out there that are kind of more systemic than procedural narrative. And Ken Levine's got a very good narrative Lego talk that's talking that he did at GCC a couple of years ago about systemic narrative and putting together systemic narrative. And that actually still involves writers a lot, but generating a huge amount of content and having spending a long time working on how the lines are kind of programmed and trigger and things like that. But thankfully, that does seem to involve writers quite a bit. But you're just generating a lot of content that won't necessarily be seen through every playthrough, but it does mean replayability is a big factor in it.
And the other thing is, if you're going to voice record, which from a commercial perspective is important to do, then of course you're hugely limited as well. Mm-hmm. You look at games like 80 Days, which is fantastic, but when you're generating that's the lines directly, then you couldn't possibly record them, and that then limits the commercial opportunities that you would otherwise have.
Although DeepMind has obviously just started working on a project of like an amazingly accurate and very quick text-to-speech computing, so it can a computer with a very uncomputer voice is able to read and pronounce speech.
So we're not only getting rid of writers, we're also getting rid of voice
actors as well. I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen. I'm just
fantastic.
So speaking of kind of 80 Days and the stuff you were saying about emergent narratives and stuff, what other work in games writing, not your own, are you interested in? What's kind of exciting you that other people are doing?
Well, as I said before, the games like Inside, the ability to tell a story in a very powerful story purely through gameplay is something that we need to. I'm sort of waffling here because I'm hoping that you're going to take over. And I mentioned 80 Days only because I think that was very interesting as well in the way that it kind of was surprising, and it just was so full of it's just everywhere you went, new things happened, and you could play the game multiple times, and you knew that it was happening just for you.
You mentioned two interesting games in your talk, which were Stanley Parable and Her Story, which you claimed for the adventure genre. And I think those are really interesting because they're kind of really examining both of those things are really kind of examining what games are and what stories are, aren't they?
Absolutely, and both were very successful as well. I think Her Story in particular, I mean, I'm involved with the BFI, and it's quite interesting because the BFI is obviously the British Film Institute, and the definition of film 5 years ago was that it has to be shown it needs to have a theatrical release. Whereas now we're looking back and saying, well, a film doesn't need to have a theatrical release. A linear film might be commissioned by Amazon or Netflix and never see a theatrical release. And a game like Her Story is clearly a film. It's a game as well, but it's clearly an interactive film. But it's not a rubbish one like the interactive narratives that we had. Sorry, the interactive movies that we had in the 80s. So there's lots of really interesting things where everything is blurring. And I think that the big companies clearly are going to stick to what they know. But I think and there's little cracks, the intermedial cracks between film and video games and apps. That are really interesting things. And you were a BAFTA judge. We were both BAFTA judges, and it was really interesting to see a raft of games that again were surprising. They thrilled you because you didn't know it could be done. And there's a real divergence now between the big $100 million games, which are great. They're great, but they don't surprise you in the way that the little ones do.
Is there anything happening in the AAA space with story writing that is interesting to either of you? I mean, because obviously Tomb Raider is a big budget game. Is there any room in that kind of when you have that size of budget to do anything interesting with storytelling?
I'm sort of a little interested in seeing what David Cage does with Detroit, despite being basically put off his games after playing Fahrenheit, which I finished and just felt really angry about. But
I predict there'll be a scene where a female character is showering. That's my prediction for his next game. There has been one in the last 3 games.
The first half an hour of Fahrenheit was so good. Like, I kind of hang on to the fact that if he could only take that half an hour experience and then sort of spin it out to a kind of 10, 12 hour game, it could be perfect. And he seems to be sort of learning a little bit with each game. And I think it was quite interesting what he was doing with Beyond Two Souls, but I think also why it sort of failed a little bit is very interesting as well, because I've read kind of breakdowns of it that are about kind of comparing that to something like The Walking Dead, which The Walking Dead makes it very obvious when you make choices. But Beyond Two Souls, you're making a lot of choices and you're not aware of them. And so it's a bit more like life, I guess. But, I mean, the way we are as gamers and kind of what we expect can sort of play into that, I think. And I did like, a few bits and pieces I played of Beyond Two Souls. So I'm sort of interested in Detroit. I mean, I'm obviously kind of worried it's just going to be, a pastiche of Blade Runner and, basically Blade Runner, I guess, and kind of iRobot and stuff like that. But I think he's got some interesting ideas for kind of dialogue mechanics and triggering, and so that's one I'm looking forward to. I'm interested in kind of seeing how systemic narrative develops. But as Charles said, it's the indie space where so much creativity is coming from at the moment. And a personal favourite of mine is Papers, Please. And that also has got diversity of theme as well. Who would have thought that being a border control officer would be kind of fun? And it's sort of always fun and not fun, and it kind of mechanises guilt and gamifies bureaucracy. But it all somehow works. I thought that was so clever. And again with 80 Days as well, changing the perspective to Passepartout instead of Phileas Fogg, that added so much to it. And yeah, I mean, it is the kind of indie games that I think are bringing the freshest ideas to the table. I do think AAA games are sort of taking notice, but it takes such a long time for them to sort of adapt. It's like
and they have to be very risk averse, obviously, with such huge budgets.
And shareholders, and I think they're paying attention, but how long it takes to kind come through. I mean, we started getting father narratives, which I guess was something.
But
you
the
only-
dadification of games.
But I think it's going to take a while before you get the mummification of games, which, sounds like something completely different.
Did you object to being told that Clementine will remember that?
No.
Because
No,
I
but-
think in a way, obviously in Beyond Two Souls there were all these choices, but if you find it difficult to really tell, because in life, of course, every choice has a
Yeah.
repercussion, whereas in a video game it doesn't. So I actually quite liked knowing which ones were significant, because then that gave me a context into understanding how it affected the future.
Yeah, but also there was a further layer, and you didn't know like how that was going to play out in terms of. Sometimes when they said that, it was almost like, well, that they was kind of playing you, because you suddenly get panicked, going, "Oh my god!" And going back and checking what you've done, and sometimes her remembering something wouldn't actually play out, but they were just sort of panicking you as a player a little bit. But I think it's one of the things all the mad things that we accept as gamers, like, bark dialogues and, being able to heal by crouching behind a small wall, that sort of thing. There's so much which we accept as gamers that would make no sense in other entertainment mediums.
I thought that was the real beauty of Walking Dead with those Clementine will remember that, because it doesn't tell you exactly what it is about what you've done. Is it going to be good that she remembers it? Is it going to be bad? And it forces you to question what you've done in the game. And it's very rare for games to do that, isn't it? To make you as a player really question what you've done and your motives. And it's one of the only games that have done that. And do you think that's something that games could maybe do more? Start bringing in how we are as individuals when we're playing video games?
Well, clearly they have branching narratives in that regard, and that is their big USP. I mean, I think they're great, but they're not really games in the way they're much more interactive narratives, and that's not meant as a criticism at all. But because of that, that is the way that they're designed. It would be a lot harder, I think, for us to do that, because clearly you can't have the explosion of the combinations. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I think they do really, really well. I really admire Telltale. But that is their thing, and I think that you lose quite a lot of gameplay that you would otherwise have if they went down a more normal, mainstream narrative approach.
Although arguably Life is Strange kind of took that and sort of built on the gameplay elements of it in a really interesting way, I think.
Oh yeah, because Life is Strange
Yes,
does
it
the
is.
interesting thing where you can, as part of the game, you can rewind time, which is something gamers have been doing anyway. They make a choice and then they reload an earlier save. But I'm dropping my pen. Life is Strange made that actually part of the mechanics of the game. Have you seen any other games that have done that kind of thing, like taken something that gamers already do and made it kind of part of the narrative? That's probably a really difficult question.
Well, Stanley Parable does that, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, well, let's talk about different formats then, and kind of the differences between these big budget games and the smaller ones, because both of you have worked on iOS games, haven't you? What's the difference between working? So, Rihanna, you've worked on the big console games like Tomb Raider, and then you've worked on smaller mobile games, right? Am I right in thinking this?
Only
you contributed
really
a little
one,
bit,
which
okay.
is Rival Kingdoms.
Yes.
So I mean, I was basically a character generator in the end for Rival Kingdoms. I just helped the developers put a wrapper around the world and kind of why it exists like it does, and then they sort of kept me on and just writing more and more characters for them, because they have a element called Ancients, which are all these kind of gods and warriors and angels and demons and spirits and things that have all come from different dimensions to fight on this one plane. And so my job was basically creating lots of characters with about sort of just a 450-word bios that would be revealed as the player sort of played more of the game or used them more in the battlefield. But they proved to be kind of really popular with players who will go out to just collect these characters and their bios. And they renewed my contract about 3 times, so I must have been doing something right. But I've done about 55 of them, and there's such a lot of now I've had to say pass the baton on to someone else, because it's like I had come up with it's a really great creative exercise actually, but now I'm thinking, I don't want to give away all my story ideas. But yeah, I mean, they found a way of keeping me very writerly within that kind of space, which was interesting. But
is that surprising for you to be able to exercise those writerly skills in that kind of format?
Yeah, it was, I think, because sometimes it's been difficult to exercise writerly skills in the kind of big games. You know, as I was saying, all of the Tomb Raider writers probably enjoy our secondary narrative more than anything else, because that's where we got more time to be writerly. That wasn't subjected to the white hot blowtorch of kind of feedback and kind of analysis and testing that everything else was. So yeah, getting that space to be writerly can be difficult sometimes. It's like being in a bath, and you can sort of splash around and you can get a little bit wet, but you can't really spread out that much. And then I found going into film or going into a kind of more narrative heavy games, you suddenly get like you're in a pond or a lake, and you're getting much more time to kind of be a writer and much more space. But I mean, having said that, boundaries can make you more creative, and the stuff you can come up with within those limits can surprise you.
What do you think, Charles? Do you think mobile games can tell great stories?
Well, I'm wondering whether writerly is a proper word or not.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't? No. I think it's a great word. I think it's great. Well, to state the bleeding obvious about mobile, obviously you have people playing with a much shorter attention span, and of course this obsession with free-to-play, which makes it really... It's a different kind of approach. I showed a slide actually in my time that over 90% of the revenues on iTunes are now free to play, and we're lucky because both Apple and Google are very keen to make sure that the premium area stays. So we get a lot of support with the games that we write, and we're selling them for $10, and we say to people that this is what it costs, and we do quite well from it. It's great, but we're this tiny slither at the very very top. So for mobile, we're basically saying we're writing a full-price game that you would otherwise have a PC on a mobile or on a console, and we're delivering on mobile, and we hope you enjoy it. Most of our sales are on tablet rather than iPhone. It's not written specifically for mobile. The people making the megabucks are obviously the ones who are really cracking free-to-play, where people are playing for 2 or 3 minutes at a time while they're waiting to do something else.
Well, one thing I guess about smartphone and mobile games, tablet games, is that you are potentially reaching a very different audience. Like one of the things I guess with consoles and PCs is you're reaching an audience that buys into the idea of games as entertainment, people identify as gamers. I don't know if you've seen recently there's a featuring games industry.biz which has got quite a lot of attention. And it's entitled "Video Games Are Boring" by a video game developer called Brie Code, who said that she tried to get some of her friends to be interested in video games, and she was trying to work out why they didn't like them. And they said, "Well, we're just really not interested in the idea of threat. When we're interested in exploring characters and exploring stories and experimenting with ourselves in these worlds, but we're not really interested in the idea of being chased by snakes or monsters." And she had this kind of Road to Damascus style revelation that, hang on, isn't there just an enormous, massive audience of people who aren't playing games at the moment? I just wondered, if you'd both either read that feature or thought about the idea of the fact that there's people who will play games on tablets, or maybe even will go and play a console that's in their house, that just aren't being reached by the games that we're making now.
I saw it and I didn't read it. So all I would say is that, again, stating the bleeding obvious, what we are doing is we're writing an experience that, because it's interactive, you have to work from the moment you start playing the game. So therefore, I do suspect there are a number of people who really have no interest in that, and that they would much rather have a linear experience where they can sit back and wait for it. So I think we have a huge, wonderful, diverse audience, but I suspect that not everybody is going to want to play the games that we write. So I'm not sure that that's answering the question particularly well, but certainly the I mean, one of the reasons, and Rhiannon, I hope will agree, that one of the constraints that we have in storytelling is that because you're working, you have to set up the empathetic characters really, really quickly. Certainly in the games that we would write, I think probably both of us, you would do that in the inciting incident in the intro, so that when you first start playing the game, You know what the motivations of the characters are, you know who that characters are, you have some sort of empathy, and that then means that you have a motivation to actually solve the puzzles. Whereas obviously if you were reading a book or watching a film or whatever in linear medium, you'd be very, very happy to wait considerably longer before the inciting instance, before you'd built empathy with your characters. And that's both, I think, a strength and a weakness. But for some people, I suspect they don't like the fact that it has to be all done so quickly, and then you're thrown into this world with a motivation, with problems that you have to solve.
I mean, I do believe that there is a game out there for everyone, but it tends to be the sort of quieter games that don't get enough sort of press, and so that I did sort of skim read that article to go back to later. But I think the quieter games are not as well known about, and so they're probably just not reaching the audience as much as those games are not being developed for that audience. It tends to be like the big AAA blockbusters that are very high on action and often violence or tension that tend to get the kind of big press and the big marketing, and I think that is a big reason behind it. But I think we are. I do, as I've got older, I do feel that we are becoming a bit too reliant in the AAA space on kind of highly active, very violent narratives. And this is coming from someone that, one, has worked on violent narratives, and two, quite enjoys playing them.
Tomb Raider, an incredibly violent game, by the way, the most recent ones.
Yes. That's not my fault. I find it tense and difficult even to watch, let alone play.
Lara dies in some really grotesque ways for anyone who hasn't played it. One of the interesting things that was mentioned in that article, though, is she was talking about introducing video games to her friends who kind of tentatively expressed an interest, and she thought, of course, well, I'll get them to play Journey. That's the classic like arty game that gamers love. But she played Journey, and there was this big snake thing, and she was like, oh, I can't deal with that, and so she turned it off. And then she tried to get her to play Skyrim, thinking, I liked all the characters in Skyrim, but of course Skyrim's all about fighting and dragons, and she wasn't interested in any of that. And I guess I kind of wanted to ask you, A, are you proud of the industry you work in? Do you ever feel kind of embarrassed when you talk to people outside of games about what you do? Do you ever feel like you have to couch the explanation of what you do and all these kind of, but it is, trust me, that games can be interesting. And also, if you were to introduce somebody who didn't play video games to a video game that you think kind of tells stories in a really interesting way, or one that you just think is a good starting point, where would you go? So 2 questions, and you can pick whichever one you feel most comfortable answering.
What was the first one?
So sometimes when you're talking to people who don't
Yes,
work in the
thank
video games
you.
industry,
What I would say is that in the UK we have a habit of being rather sniffy about high art, and certainly for the first 20 years or so, video games were really looked down on. That and what was wonderful was going to Germany, going to America, and actually having this respect that we just didn't have in the UK. That, to me, I think has changed profoundly. So people say, what do? You go, I write video games. And that is an interesting thing to say. It creates... People, even if they don't play video games, are interested. So I actually think that the premise of the question, I would disagree slightly with it, because I don't think you need to. I think we can be very proud, both to our dinner party friends, and also as far as the medium and the theory and how we can drive it forward. So no, I'm very proud of what we do.
Yeah, I'm proud of what we do as well, but I do think there's such a lot of room to grow, and I'm very proud, particularly, even though I'm not really working in it, and I'm doing a little bit of work in the indie scene, but particularly in the way that the indie scene is bringing new ideas to the table and having things to say and looking at diversity of theme and perspective, I think is so important. I would like to see that trickling upwards, if even that is a thing to happen to the kind of blockbuster games. Or even seeing the development of the middle ground, which I think has become a bit of a wasteland. Like when I started out in the industry, there were lots of sort of mid-budget games. And then they slowly got eroded, and to the point where it now seems like there's just indie and then there's huge kind of AAA. And both have things to add. And I keep thinking that if the middle ground could get reinvigorated again, and Overlord was pretty much a middle ground game, and it probably got sneaked up into AAA territory just because the kind of press liked it, and it was pretty refreshing. Where you've got the kind of creativity and kind of imagination coming from the indie scene, and you've got the kind of performance and the technology and the acting talent and story sensibilities coming from AAA. And like I keep thinking, I think Telltale are probably occupying this sort of space as well. That really needs to be invigorated and kind of take the best of both worlds, if possible.
And David Cage would be. I mean, his games are so expensive to write.
Yeah, I mean, they're considered AAA. They're AAA.
Sorry,
but,
no, they're the middle ground.
Are they?
They're sort of $15 million, $20 million.
That's the middle ground is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well,
So do you think?
I always thought they were AAA, but yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, we have time probably for one more question. Keith, do you have a question that you're just burning to ask?
Well, this might wrap it up quite nicely then, hopefully. So, so about I guess 20 years ago, movies were considered where you'd go to as a culture to see society and culture represented. So you'd go to movies, and that felt like the place to go to work out where culture was, where mainstream culture was. Now it's very much kind of Netflix, box set television, the big drama series. Television is very much where now we go to see ourselves reflected as a culture, as a mainstream culture. Do you think at any stage in the future it will be video games that people go to sort of where the exciting thing that everybody wants to, the water cooler, conversational stuff in the offices around the world won't be like Mad Men or Game of Thrones? It will be a video game. Do you think that will happen?
I mean, it's happened a little bit with Pokemon Go. Actually, I think that became a bit of a water cooler game, at least for a while. Maybe. I guess if that can happen, then and possibly VR, once it becomes a little bit more mass market, could push that forward. I mean, I think it is already is that for a certain portion of the audience, but I think until we start getting, and I'm going on about diversity a lot, I know, into the medium, we're so far behind, and I don't think until we start being a bit braver about everything that we're going to kind of match everything else. Like, I feel we've gone quite a long way, but there's still so much more we can do, and so much more, many ways that we can utilize the power of this medium. Yeah, I mean, I think it's all part and parcel of it. I don't know whether they'll ever be the completely the go-to thing, but I think there'll be these little flickering games that come up like Pokemon Go that do sort of capture the collective imagination of a wider audience.
I mean, it could just be a matter of time, right? Because the younger generation, 100% of people play video games under the age of 16. So once they're in the kind of...
that's true.
Yeah.
I think
What do you think, Charles?
You'd say something like Grand Theft Auto 5, which was so hugely successful. That was definitely a water cooler game, or Red Dead Redemption, which is, people are really looking forward to. I would say that actually that we do have our water cooler. Well, it's not... Clearly, what's going on in telly at the moment is really, really exciting, and it's taken the where film used to lead in these areas, as you say, television does now, and I think we have a responsibility to write games that do look back at society, and they will be better for it, and they will have a wider audience. So it's not doing it because we feel there's a responsibility. We do it because they're actually going to become more compelling, and hopefully we'll sell a few more.
Awesome. A good place to wrap up, I think. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but I'm going to anyway.
Why not?
A round of applause.
Thank you very much, Charles and Rhianna Pratchett. Thank you.